So the last Cuphead video I made was 2 years ago, where I successfully beat the game without ever pressing the shoot button, which to be honest was what I thought was the pinnacle of Cuphead challenges, as the whole point of the game is to run and gun. But recently I came across a mod that piqued my interest enough to return to the scene, and lo and behold, you can now fight not just one but 2 bosses in the game, which as you can see was, it was diabolical. And so today I'll be trying to beat the game again and see if I still have what it takes to be called a Cuphead connoisseur by beating every boss in the base game, or I'm just a washed up gamer who is way past his prime and I should just move on to getting a real job to become a productive member of society. No, anything but that. Can I overcome every one of the duplicate boss battles in this already incredibly difficult game, or will I end up admitting that this challenge may have been a bit too much? Let's find out. Alright, so as you can see, when we open the menu panel here, there is a new section called mod option, and inside we essentially have 3 boss types to pick from, which are same, random, and choose. The same option allows us to double the boss and fight the same one at once. Random will randomly generate a boss on top of the original one you decide to fight, and for the last one, we can choose any 2 combinations of bosses we want to face. The random and choose options do sound pretty fun to do, but for the sake of content literacy, we'll save those for future videos. We can also increase our health all the way up to 9 and even up to infinity, but to make the challenge a bit more interesting and a more frequent visit to my therapist, we'll leave it at 3. As for the loadout we'll be using for the majority of the challenge, it will be the Converge, Crack Shot, the second Super Art, and the Astral Cookie. And this is because the bullets of the Converge shot have the ability to pierce through multiple enemies at once, which is gonna be our bread and butter against those pesky bosses. The Crack Shot bullets are basically an aimbot that hits the nearest target in our vicinity, so that's a no-brainer. The second Super Art, when used by Miss Chalice, results in obtaining a shield that acts as an additional HP. And lastly, equipping the Astral Cookie will allow us to use Miss Chalice, who compared to the base characters of the game has a slightly better stats with more health, an invisibility dodge roll, and a double jump. And now that we got all that sorted, it's time to face up against the first boss of the game, the Root Packs. Okay, so I'm guessing that we'll be hit with 2 mud balls, but as you can see, they are synced up pretty well to the point where I'm able to easily get through them without any issues whatsoever. And after gunning down the potato some more, next we have the onion that will now rain down double the amount of teardrops, which I guess is slightly harder but still not enough to cause too much trouble, aside from losing 2 HP from being a bit rusty at the game. And then for the last phase, we have the carrot who shoots out a laser beam from its forehead and an army of carrot missiles chasing you down, which compared to my no-shoot challenge was a walk in the park, as I could now, shoot them down. And surprisingly, the laser beams were also synced up perfectly, where I didn't have to face 2 separate ones firing at me in different intervals. So yeah, overall the Root Packs were a piece of cake. But unfortunately, that will be the last time I'll ever be using that term, as starting with Goopy here is where the difficulty of this challenge really sets in. And this is due to the fact that compared to the Root Packs, the 2 Goops here are programmed to not sync up as closely, which in turn results in an attack pattern that either has one of them doing the face lunge attack while the other one is still bouncing around the screen. My initial attempt did lead to a couple of close calls, but that didn't last when I got to the second phase, when Goopy here decided to let himself go. And now we have a lot less space to work with, as the 2 groups take up almost half of the screen, still sporadically jumps in different intervals, and it stops to throw a TKO punch at you, while yes, the other one is still bouncing around with that chunky dad bod. Yeah, I didn't last more than 20 seconds, or the several attempts after that. But just then, I discovered something that may have been my saving grace for not just my fight against Goopy here, but probably for the remainder of the entire challenge. And that was when I used my Super Art to gain a shield. I could fire at max 3 EX moves before my super meter completely tanked out, which allowed me to dish out a ton more damage during the second phase, resulting in just losing 2 of my HP before moving on to the third phase. And unlike the second phase, this one was a lot more manageable, in which I just had to move side to side to avoid getting damaged by the Thwomping Leg Gravestone. And after a few more dodging, I was able to overcome my very first obstacle. I say that because the Root Packs were honestly a joke. Oh, and one other thing I should mention is that as you saw in my fight against Goopy, you only need to knock out one of the bosses to defeat them, in which I am extremely grateful to the dev of the mod, because this challenge is already hard enough as it is. And what better way to show it by taking on the next boss, which is Ribby and Croak, which you can tell I was not looking forward to at all. The fight begins with the 2 Croaks spitting them bugs out, which I could relatively manage with the Converge, but as soon as the 2 Ribbies hurled them Street Fighter moves, I was in for a real treat, and by that I mean death. But one thing I noticed I could do was, with enough retries, I could manipulate the attack patterns to where it'll sync up perfectly, which made the fight no different than just having to deal with one of the frogs. Then when we get to the second phase, it gets a little tricky, as Ribby will now throw in some glowing balls, which isn't so bad when they sync up, but when they don't, it is not fun at all, especially since Croaks' fan attacks kept tampering with my movements. But the worst part is when we get to the third phase, where one of the frog bros turns into a slot machine and the other one is still chucking them balls at me, and then once the other one also transforms, the whole fight basically turns into a torture chamber. And I say this because certain combinations of the slot machine's attacks make it near impossible to not take a hit. The only attacks I could somewhat manage was when they were the same colored attacks, or the green and yellow ones combined, well, sort of. One tweak I made throughout the fight was changing to the Crackshot for the last phase, since it dealt more damage overall, because I could still hit the boss when facing away from him, as opposed to the converge. And with that tiny tweak and a bit of luck, I managed to overcome my gambling addiction. My gambling machine. The gambling machine. Anyways, our next battle was against Hildeberg, who was gonna be our first plane battle in this challenge. Oh, and would you look at that, we're not using Miss Chalice anymore. Well, I guess this is as good a time as ever to explain why I switched her out for our favorite blue mug. Hey, what about me? Can it, you gambling addict? You see, with the Astral Cookie being a charm, using it will deny us of equipping these other charms that provide a lot more variety of advantages. Like the Coffee charm that gradually increases our super meter to use our super art more often, which the Astral Cookie doesn't have. The Smoke Bomb that gives us invincibility frames whenever we shrink ourselves, which the Astral Cookie doesn't have. The Heart Ring that will add an extra 1 HP for every first, third, and sixth successful parries, which of course the Astral Cookie doesn't have. The Divine Relic, which basically allows us to use all those charms I just mentioned, where, what do you know, the Astral Cookie still doesn't have it. The point is, the Astral Cookie is astronomically inferior compared to any other charm we can use, so with that said, I chose the Heart Ring for this fight. Now, some of you might argue that I should have maybe chosen the Divine Relic, but the reason I didn't is because one downside of using it was that the bullets changed every time I either shrunk myself or I repeatedly pressed my shoot button, which was a pretty big handicap for a guy like me with ADHD that is definitely legit and not self-diagnosed, here's proof. And also keeping track of my choice of firearms during all this crap was not ideal. Anyways, the first phase starts off with the two Hildas hahaing their way to striking me down, along with these tiny planes called Zeppelins that will shoot bullets at us, with the purple one shooting just one shot with an occasional pink bullet that we can parry, and the green ones that will fire multiple ones in a cone. She then has a total of 3 transformations, which is turning into a bull called Tarius that will lunge at us every 5 seconds or so whenever we are parallel to it. Gemini twins that after doing an incantation will summon a vortex of sorts, which will launch a line of bullets that either go clockwise or counterclockwise. And lastly, Sagittarius, who fires a massive arrow along with 3 blue stars that will home in on us until we get absolutely eviscerated. The bull phase isn't as bad, as we just need to linger at the top to avoid all the lunge attacks and occasionally dodge the bullets of the Zeppelins. But as for the other 2 phases, there isn't much I could do other than pray the 2 vortexes won't rotate in opposite directions to create an inescapable attack, and run from the blue stars of the Centaur and get rid of them with my bomb bullets. Thankfully though, on regular mode, the transformation between the Geminis and the Sagittarius is random, in which Hilda will only ever transform into one of them. And on my 14th attempt, I got lucky enough to have both Hildas transform into Geminis to not have to deal with the Sagittarius phase along with the vortex bullets shooting in the same direction, resulting in losing just 1 HP before moving on to the next phase. And in this phase, Hilda reverts back to her normal self with a few changes to her attacks, which now on top of her haha, she creates a gust of tornado that will chase after us, causing me to take a couple of hits before transitioning into her final phase. And this is where it got real problematic, as now I have to dodge a crap ton of stars as well as a whole lot of extraterrestrial frisbees at the top of the screen that fires lasers at different intervals. And the worst part was that I had to identify each of the UFOs by their respective colors, with red ones firing as soon as I got under them and the brown ones firing whenever I got close. On top of that, there would sometimes be cases where when the 2 overlapped, it created yet another inescapable attack called IREF, which is short for I Regret Everything, FML. However, the goddess of victory smiled upon me yet again, as I didn't have to deal with any of them for this round, which led me to nab the victory with just 1 health remaining. Then comes the final battle before we enter the next aisle, which is gonna be against Cagney Carnation, aka Flowey the Flower. And for this fight, we are of course gonna be changing back to Chalice, since her mobility will be especially important, as Cagney here gets a bit crazy with his attacks. And what I mean by that is that there isn't a single moment to get a breather, as I found myself constantly flushed with his carnivore plants, sycamore boomerangs, sea umbrellas, acorn bullets, and these 2 guys spitting pink tic tacs at me. What's more, there's this double head booping action I had to avoid, in which without Chalice's double jump, I would have been guaranteed to take damage. Except for when I choke, which again, I haven't played the game for 2 years, so yeah, I'm not bad, maybe not as good, please don't judge me. And once we get through that phase, Cagney then shoves his hands in the ground to cover the floor with its vines, and also proceeds to spit out dandelions, or in Sid's case, dandelions, where the pink ones can be parried and the white ones are just hurtful. Much like the way you guys are probably laughing at my Sid impression, in which case I don't care because I absolutely nailed it. And speaking of hurtful, mind I remind you that these vines that shoot up were relentless in their pursuit to decimate my health, as having 2 Cagneys often caused them to devoid me of finding a safe place to stand. Yeah, even with Miss Chalice, I was struggling with this one. But on my 7th attempt or so, I managed to get to the last phase without taking a single hit, and then with the help of filling on my super meter to activate my shield pal, I eventually beat the overgrown Carnation Flower. And with Cagney out of the way, I now had access to the second aisle, in which I immediately gravitated towards choosing Bonnie as my first opponent, where now I had to face off against 2 of her 5 insanely annoying candy lackeys at once. And you can imagine how poorly it went for my first few attempts. Anyways, the fight begins with Bonnie summoning just one of the minions at first, and once I dealt with that one, she then sends out 2 new ones at the same time. And this is sort of really bad, because not only does it desync the fight, but doing so leads to one of the Bonnies transitioning into the final phase to chase after me, and the other one firing her cotton candy gun while one of her minions is still wrecking havoc in the scene. And after I take the minions down, well, let's just say regular mode Bonnie turns into expert mode, where 2 of her heads frantically homes in on me until I am unalive. Thankfully, I found that using the converge for the first few phases was optimal, as pressing the A button to lock in my aim condensed the shots to deal more damage, and also because of the finger gun's ability to pierce through multiple enemies, I was able to cruise through the small fries. And then I switched back to the crack shot for when I entered the final phase, since I only needed to take down one of the bodies in order to defeat her. Plus, I didn't really have the self-awareness to keep myself from not dying while aiming with the converge, so yeah, I didn't really care if the crack shot bullets were hitting the minions or boss or whatever on the screen. As long as I was alive, I knew that I was dealing damage, which eventually led to bringing her candiness down. And bringing her down, I did. The next boss I decided to fight was the Jimmy the Great, which was gonna be our second plane battle in this challenge. Now, the Jimmy is able to throw out one of 3 attacks from this chest box here, which are his cat statues, flying blades, and a buttload of shiny things with each attack containing a parryable object. And when you have 2 Digimis, well, let's just say that it gets a little claustrophobic to say the least. Thankfully, I knew a strat where I could lap around him to avoid some of the attacks, and also I did a whole lot of resetting to avoid the treasure attacks out of the chest, because that one was just a load of nonsense I did not want to deal with. And after getting through the first phase, we enter the next ridiculous obstacle, which is to get through these pillars. And I say ridiculous because, as you can see, 2 of them overlap, and the only one through them is to pray that both pillars have the breakable rows on the same spot, which, as you may know, did not come by often. So to minimize the amount of times I got hit, I made sure to get my super meter as close to full as possible and activated my super bomb to utilize the invincibility frames it provided to get through some of the pillars. Also, I discovered that once I took damage, I could get through at max 3 pillars at a time, which I of course implemented the same strat whenever I used my super art. Also, keep in mind that I can get a max of 3 health back with the heart ring charm, so losing 1 or 2 health was still pretty much the best case scenario going into the third phase. And in this phase, we can actually relax a bit, since we can just stay at the top and change our weapon of choice to that of the bomb, in which we can just constantly drop at the slug the Jimmy squirming out of the astral plane coffin. We do occasionally need to move side to side though to avoid his eyeballs with halos, but it wasn't anything too crazy that I couldn't handle. Once that's over, we transition into the fourth phase, where the Jimmy will bring out a puppet version of us that will shoot bubbles at us, with the last one being parryable, and also 2 sentient turbines firing bullets in 4 separate directions to then slowly turning counterclockwise to make it extra tricky to dodge. The best way to get through this phase was to save up my super art to use it as soon as the Pinocchios fired their bubble shots to avoid their initial onslaught, and then evade the rest of the attacks, as well as parrying the pink bubbles as many times as I can to then use my super art once more to enter the final phase. And in the last phase, the Jimmy summons a total of 6 rotating pyramids that will shoot out purple lasers in 4 different lines, and with 2 of them shooting one after the other, my chances of survival was practically 0. However, in one of my attempts, I got super lucky by losing just 1 health in the second phase, where I had 2 pillars I could get through to then using my super art to avoid another 2 to then damage boosting the last one. Adding that with the perfect sync of the puppets shooting me in the fourth phase, it made it a lot easier to dodge and parry their attacks. Then I entered the last phase with a total of 3 health, which I then proceeded to get as close to the Jimmy's face whenever I had the chance, in which I used the super bomb once and used my Chopper X move in the end, leading to my victory. Now, I didn't know about it at first, but after the fight against the Jimmy, I realized that throughout this video, every single one of the plane battles was gonna be an absolute grind, especially the one against Dr. Cal, which I don't even know if it's possible. But let's worry about that later, as taking on these 2 clowns is gonna be more than enough to induce the same miserable feeling. The first phase starts with Beppy desyncing with one of them dashing at me, while the other one follows soon after, which led to dropping in the middle to be quite ineffective. So instead, I restarted the fight until they synced up relatively close to one another, which in turn allowed for an easier time jumping over them. And after we get through this phase, it was now time to not panic over the fact that I was gonna need to dodge all these inflatable doggos while frantically hopping over a group of dummy passengers seated on a roller coaster train. Oh, and did I mention that this continues on in the third phase, while 2 Beppies riding on a carousel horse nays out hoofs, in which when 2 of them appear on the opposite sides, it creates an impossible to dodge attack. Honestly, the main issue was really the roller coaster, which made everything harder to dodge. But thankfully, the second phase wasn't as bad as the third phase when it came to having a bit more space to evade the attacks, so in this attempt, I was able to move on to the next phase with all 4 of my health. And as for the third phase, I just did my best to survive as long as I can while racking up my super meter to then activate it when it was full, which, as I have mentioned, will allow us to get off 3 EX moves. And in doing this, it accelerated the time it took to get to the next phase a lot quicker, which in turn led me to conserve 2 health before entering the final phase. And as ironic as it was, the final phase was pretty much the easiest phase out of all 4 phases, because with 2 Beppies, I was given more platforms to stand on and the roller coasters swish across the screen more often, which in turn rendered the green penguins Beppy spat out absolutely useless because they got completely wiped out by the speeding coasters until the coasters stopped coming by, which then I got utterly obliterated by them baseballs. But thankfully, the coasters are set on a loop, so eventually it came by again, which gave me enough time to get in a bit more damage to then defeat the Umbrella Head. And now we are back in the skies pinned against these 2 chicken nuggets, and trust me when I say this is gonna be one of the most difficult playing battles yet. And this was because 2 Wallies meant that I had to dodge double the amount of all of his screen clogging attacks that consists of eggs bursting into 3 eggshell pieces, this giant 3-way bullets firing out of his head, his feather attacks in the second phase that, mind you, when desynced is an absolute pain to evade since the patterns at which the feathers come my way crosses over one another, making it way more difficult to anticipate. His third phase where his spiky eggs will periodically expand and contract all the while rotating all over the map, making it a nightmare to stay alive. And the last phase is just yeah, I'm not even gonna try. This was probably the point at which I started to doubt whether this challenge was possible or not, but thankfully with enough repetitions, I began to notice a few things that increased the chances of my success. And that was for the first phase, I could actually hang around the very top of the screen, more specifically around this spot right here to evade most if not all of Wally's attacks. And then I could just use my bomb bullets to deal damage to both of them, which I guess you can call it a bit of a cheese, but not really because you still need to be careful not to extend or backtrack too much in order to avoid taking unnecessary hits. Next was the second phase, where the biggest issue I was dealing with was Wally's distinct feather attack. And to combat it, I made sure to deal enough damage against the two Wallys in the first phase, just enough so I could use my super art to sync up both their feather attacks, or as close as possible to make it a lot more manageable to dodge them. After that comes the third phase, which at this point was pretty much useless to sync up both of the birdos, as they will move around the screen however they please. So instead of trying to sync them up, I instead save up my super meter in the second phase to unload it as soon as I transition into the third phase to dish out a ton of damage in the early stages of the fight. Also, I found that I lost most of my health in the third phase, so super bombing the two birds early on was gonna lead to shortening the time I needed to spend trying to survive, leading to more health moving on to the final phase. And once I managed to be fortunate enough to make it to the last phase, well, there isn't much I could do other than change my shot to the bomb bullet and dodge all the crazy projectiles that I fell victim to many times, to the point where it drove me to do a bit of a death slamming in the process. I am never eating chicken for the rest of my life! That day I ordered some chicken, because let's face it, I'll never stop eating it. I was just trying to make a point. Anyways, Wally alone took me about 30 minutes to get relatively good at, and within that time frame, I was able to make it to the final phase 5 times, which is absolutely terrible. However, unlike the initial 15 minutes I spent trying to brute force the whole fight and thinking to myself that this challenge was just downright impossible, with all the knowledge I had accrued for the latter half of the fight, on the 6th time I got to the final phase, I somehow dealt with just one Wally for the initial 5 seconds, which resulted in a less harsher encounter with Wally as opposed to dealing with 2 of them at the very beginning of the phase. And by playing out of my mind along with a few insanely clutch moments, I was able to survive long enough to get my super art back up to then bring down the chicken tender with an explosive finish. Man, that was a painful one. Good news is, our last battle for Inkwell Al 2 was gonna be against Grimmy here, who I'm just gonna say was nowhere near as horrifying thanks to Chalice's mechanics, allowing us to seamlessly dodge all the attacks Grimmy threw at us in the first phase, easily avoid the leaping sentient flames with her double jump in the second phase, and finally use the charge finger gun to damage him whenever I saw an opening and not shoot at the orbs in order to avoid his 4-way attack in the final phase. And I kid you not, I literally beat this guy in my second attempt, so yeah, there's really not much to talk about this fight other than giving me a short boost of confidence that will only last for about 5 seconds from now, because we are gonna be entering the very last area, Inkwell Al 3. And the first boss I chose to face up against was the Queen Bee herself, Rumor Honeybottom. A fight that was gonna require the lover, as it had one of the highest DPS for a finger gun, and its X move did a crazy amount of damage. Not to mention, the bullets fired downwards, which was gonna be a huge help in the final phase, as Rumor was mostly situated in the very bottom of the screen. But before that, I had to first gun down her minions in the first phase using the Converge, which I did so swiftly by pressing down the aim button to deal more damage, all the while maneuvering around these ticking time bombs and also the worker bees. Then once that phase was over, things started to ramp up with 2 Rumors raining down from above, to which I had to deal with one of 3 movesets, which were her pink sphere attacks that followed me wherever I went, her triangle attacks that fired 3 smaller ones, and this absolute bullet pandemonium. Although these attacks would at times sync up, which made it a lot easier to dodge them, because there were a total of 3 attacks, the majority of the time I was faced with 2 separate attack combinations. So my only method of dealing with each one was pairing the spears as they got close, staying away from the acute ends of the triangle to avoid the smaller ones, and somehow dodge the bullets whenever it's paired with a different attack, and give up when I'm faced with a double bullet spitting shenanigans. But after I somehow get through all that, we are then met with the 2 Rumors flipping through a magical book to turn themselves into planes, in which I was now gonna have to run from her homing fist and her saw attacks that could potentially come at us in both sides. But I was fortunate enough to not have to face it, which with a few more attempts, I was able to finish her off with the lobber. Following that, I went for good old Captain Brinybeard, who much like Grimmy was one of the easier bosses on this island that had a total of 2 phases with a bunch of sub-phases within those 2. In the beginning, he starts out by pulling out a pink octopus that shoots out the same Tic Tacs, the floating flower we took down back when we fought against Cagny. Except this time, we were introduced to a lot more flavors. There are also these 2 barrels dangling above that slams on the ground whenever we pass them by, but we could easily dodge roll away from them, so no issues there. Then after some time, Briny is able to call up a shark that slides in from the right, a squid that sprays its black ink all over the area to impede our vision, houndfishes that splash out of the sea to slide to the left, and the ship spits out 2 cannonballs. All of which did a number on me, where I had to go to the last phase with 1 health. But funny enough, that was all the health we needed for this final phase, as we just had to stay ducked at all times to evade the spinning fireballs the Jubilee spat out, as well as its Kamehameha laser, and dodge roll away from the barrels anytime it got close to crashing down on us, securing the win over the Moby Cruise. Next up was a visit to a war veteran of a rodent named Werner Vermin, who all this time I have been mispronouncing his name with a W instead of a V, because how the heck was I supposed to know he was German? But anyways, Werner's first phase consists of 3 attacks, with 2 of them being a cannon that shoots out cherry bombs that when it explodes on the ground, it runs a flaming shockwave of sorts, a catapult that will fling a bunch of scraps with a pink gum or 2 that can be parried, and a charge attack. When the 2 decides to stick around on opposite sides, disaster strikes as I have little to no space to work with, and going around one of them wasn't an option either. The only way I was gonna get through this was to restart the fight anytime I was met with such a predicament and use Miss Chelsea's double jumps and dashes to dodge the cherry bombs and dodge rolls for the catapult. After that comes the torture chamber, where two of the burners will go up and down to fire a flamethrower on both ends of the screens, while the bottle cap stalls on the sides buzz in and out, making it near impossible to not take a hit. But one thing I could do was sync off both burners prior to entering the second phase, which gave me a bit more room to move around, leaving me with just 1 health before going into the final phase. And immediately I was met with a whole lot of kitty paw slammage that swished in from both sides, which caused wooden planks to fall from the ceiling, and the cat also summoned phantom prisoner rats to hurl orbs that broke off when it reached the ground. And to stay alive, I tried to stay in the middle at all times so I could react quickly to the slamming paws and parry the pink orbs the ghost rats threw at me to prevent them from breaking off. One other thing I did prior to the fight was change my finger gun to the spread, as I could easily hit all 8 of my shots right in the cat's face when using the EX move, which resulted in melting the health of the oversized feline to then coming out on top. I then made my way up to take on the first of the 2 plane battles of this island, Cali Maria. And for this fight, I decided to go with the good old Divine Relic despite the handicap of my shots changing every time I struck myself and repressing my shoot button, as I felt that the charms that came with it was more vital this time around. And despite the insane clutter of attacks she threw my way with her pirate ghosts, sea urchins, mine explosions, homing dolphins, and all of them combined, with the help of the Divine Relic, I was able to get to her second phase with 2 health remaining, which thanks to the Heart Ring charm, I could easily bump it up to 5. However, things didn't pan out the way I had hoped, as parrying my way through the electric bullets was quite restricting, where I only managed to get enough to gain 2 total health back. But just as I transitioned into the final phase, I immediately lost another health, which left me with just 1 health remaining. But despite it, I remember from my previous non-shooting challenge video that I can fly right up to Callie's face, to then shrink myself to evade the incoming spike columns to cheese this fight. And surprisingly enough, I beat her on my 3rd try, which had me fully convinced that I was good enough to go straight for the mad scientist Dr. Cal, as it was evident that I had regained the level of gaming proficiency I had back when I created my last Cuphead video. I skipped it for now and went for Sally stage play instead, not because I wanted to run from my problems, but because I wanted to delay facing my problems. There's a difference. Nonetheless, Sally here was still quite a handful, as her first phase involves a total of 4 varied movesets, which are where she occasionally jumps up and corkscrews down, throws a fan that sticks to the ground and remains there for a period of time, disappear, and then dropping from the ceiling in an attempt to flatten me, and lastly, she blows us a kiss. Most of these attacks can be easily dodged with Miss Chelsea's dodge roll, but since I had to deal with 2 Sallys, I sometimes found myself running into her attacks as I tried to avoid its doppelganger. But even then, thanks to Miss Chelsea's dodge roll, I was able to easily schmoof my way out of sticky situations, in which unfortunately it didn't work for the last phase, as it involves avoiding a whole lot of toy mice and baby bottles that filled up any sort of gap that would otherwise be available if it wasn't for there being 2 Sallys. However, by bobbing and weaving as if my life depended on it, I somehow got through it. And fortunately for me, the second phase was literally the hardest phase out of the 4, as the rest just required doing a bit of nicely timed rolls and double jump dash combo, breezing through the whole thing in the very end. However, that breeze turned into a painful dose of reality, because now I had to face the one boss that I genuinely was afraid to take on for this entire challenge. And that was because no matter how perfectly I played my cards right, I still ended up with little to no health in the last phase of fighting against the madman of a scientist, Dr. Cal, which as you can guess was riddled with pain and misery. The only way I was gonna remotely have a chance at beating this mad scientist was to sync them up as best as I can to not run into a situation where one of the duck is spiraling back and forth and the other one spreading the red and blue plasma particles. And to do this, I needed to first take out the giant laser blasting antenna in the first phase, proceed to destroy the abdomen area next to get the mega bomb missiles to blow up on each other, and then pray the 2 metal heads that pops out of the giant robot will sync up, or else I'll be left with one of them lagging behind the other, which then results in a harder time equally distributing the damage dealt to each one. But after a good 20 minutes of failed attempts, I was eventually able to get it right, and by the grace of God, I was fortunate enough to not just lose 1 health for the entire fight and take the crazy scientist down, but I even got away with a perfect score, which means that beating this entire challenge again with an S rank was most likely gonna be a possibility that I wasn't about to find out just yet, cause we still had to beat this current challenge before moving on to anything crazier. Which means our next and last opponent before moving on to Inkwell All Hell was gonna be none other than the Phantom Express. And as most of you may have guessed, compared to my fight with Dr. Cal, this one was set on easy mode, since the whole fight was quite frankly not much different from fighting just one of them, except for the fact that we had more surface to move around, as doubling the bosses meant that we had double the platforms as well. Other than keeping track of focusing on one of the trains in the final phase, I had this one in the bag, which leaves us with just 2 bosses, with King Dice being the first of the 2 that I was gonna have to face. And although I just need to beat 3 of the 9 mini bosses to reach the big die head, since the title of the video was specifically called Every Boss is Double, I felt obligated to take on every single one of the mini bosses as well, which as you may have guessed was a terrible idea, since dying or redoing the fight meant that I was gonna have to start from the very beginning, turning this into a brutal gauntlet of a challenge. But nonetheless, I started off with the first mini boss against the Tipsy Troops, and what I looked for in this first battle was to make sure I didn't take more than 1 hit and preserve as much of my health as possible, as losing a life meant I lose that life permanently, and the most I can have is 7, including these dodged ones I could pick up along the way. So the strategy was to redo the fight every time I lost at least a life or two, which in the case of the first mini-boss was quite prevalent since there was a little to no room to work with while being tirelessly blitzed with attacks from every corner of the screen. But one thing I discovered was I could somewhat blitz the whole fight by jumping up and down to target all of the tipsies, which allowed for a much faster clear, resulting in a more consistent preservation of my health. Then comes Chip's bed again, whose attacks consist of lengthening itself to then swiping across the screen from one end to the other. Despite being fairly easy to dodge his attacks, I still took a hit or two due to not being able to position myself properly to avoid the attacks. But once I found the anchor point to perfectly dodge roll back and forth, this one ended up being an easy pickings for me. After that comes the harder bosses out of the 9 called Mr. Wheezy, as having 2 of them meant that it was going to be a pain to try and squeeze in between the looping fireballs he spits out, which in certain cases decimated my health. Not to mention this pincer scenario, which basically just led me to default to the redo option. But at a certain point, I wondered how far I could go even with this abysmal amount of health, and so I marched onward to the 4th mini-boss, which was Pip and Dot. And one thing I noticed in this fight was that the force at which the conveying floor moved was twice as strong, which meant that I had to perform micro taps on my left arrow key, lest I wanted to catapult myself against a spike wall on the left, while maneuvering my way over the occasional spike tiles on the ground and the other anomalies set my way. But thanks to the crack shot and Miss Chalice's mobility, I could focus all my attention in evading the hostile obstacles that surrounded me, in which I was surprisingly able to beat the swinging domino even with just 1 health. But my chances of continuing on of course came to a crashing halt when I was faced with the next mini-boss called Hocus Pocus, who I want to say was the very first massive pain point of this entire gauntlet. And it was because of this horizontal line of card suits that ascended and descended, where with Miss Chalice's kit of dashing to parry, it was close to impossible to avoid them as they required almost near perfection of a timing to evade. But even then, when including the rabbit skulls closing in on you and the suits moving in the same direction with a delay, I was almost guaranteed to lose a life or two. However, after multiple attempts, I started to find ways to avoid some of the attacks, like this one where I could parry the pink heart to escape in between the gaps, dodge roll to avoid the ones that came from the bottom, and at certain times was blessed with majority of the attacks consisting mostly rabbit skulls, which then led me to finally beat the deranged rabbit. And with that out of the way, I thought I was gonna smooth sail my way to the big die head, since the next 3 bosses were Fear Lap, Piruletta, and Mangosteen, all of which didn't have an attack pattern that I couldn't handle or drain me of my health like that of the bunny. Until I bumped into a major issue when fighting the last mini-boss called Mr. Chimes, which in order to damage him, I needed to first flip 2 of the same cards, causing the monkey to go berserk and move even faster all around the screen. However, the real kicker was the fact that there was a slight bug in the card flipping mechanism, in which the cards that were actually being flipped weren't the ones being flipped, making the matching process a nightmare to progress. And this in turn had me doubting if I may have gotten myself in an impossible situation where turning the king dice section into a gauntlet was way too difficult of an obstacle to overcome. But with an ungodly amount of attempts, I finally figured out a solution where once I somehow matched the first pair, I halted on damaging the first monkey entirely. And then I proceeded to match the cards of the second monkey. This in turn prevented both of the monkeys from going wild, as not damaging the initial monkey permanently locked the other layers of the cards from ever returning, resulting in me having to avoid the glitch entirely and giving me a slimmer of hope in beating this gauntlet. And after a few more trial and error, I was able to beat the chimps, but at the cost of losing the majority of my health, moving on to the king dice fight with just 1 HP. The pressure was unfathomable, as this was most likely gonna be my only chance to beat this gauntlet, lest I wanted to take another several hours to get to this point. However, since the hitbox to parry the pink cards was incredibly forgivable in the king dice fight, I was able to amass enough super meters to activate my shield pal and finally beat this insane boss rush of a gauntlet. But the real challenge was not over yet, as my final battle was gonna be none other than the devil, who on its own would have been considered an easy boss to beat, let alone S rank, if I had just fought one of them. But with 2, I had my work cut out for me, as what was once a battle with set patterns of attacks that were easily avoidable, it was now paired with an attack combination of infinite possibilities, as every transformation and spells were doubled to create what I believe to be the ultimate flurry of attacks that made me question whether this was truly the end of the road. But knowing that I was so close to reaching my goal, I didn't care how long it was gonna take to break through this barrier, as I had a point to prove to my audience that I wasn't a washed up Cuphead player, or worse yet, a washed up gamer. So I grinded away for hours and hours, and with time, I began to gradually adapt to the harsh succession of attacks and projectiles, which then led me to finally get to the second phase with a whopping 3 HP and a shield. And as for the rest, well, let's just say it was history. Let's go, we got this in the bag. Well, we got 3 HP. This has got to be the one. Alright, let's activate our shield pal again. Come on, let's get to the next phase already. Alright, here we go. Next phase. Let's switch to the spread so we can deal maximum damage. Oh my goodness, it got real chaotic. Oh my goodness, we lost our shield. It's okay, we can just get another one. And we're just gonna EX move the heck out of his face. Alright, we still have 3 HP and a shield. We cannot mess up at this point. Come on, give it to me. Come on. Yes! Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. That was insane. And look at that. We even got the A+. I guess this means only one thing, huh? I still got it. 20k likes and I will S rank every boss. Anyways, thanks for watching. Bye.